How is the state of Idaho expanding in the endeavor of nuclear energy, and what do you think of this?
Well, Idaho is on the forefront of trying to figure out how to use nuclear technology in new ways, new packages, micro reactors, and things like that, because we're not going to be able to address climate change issues without bringing on new, cleaner sources of energy. And nuclear energy is a really complicated one to bring on at scale. And so what's going on out in ARCO at the INL and the research that's being done into nuclear technology, I think is really important for not just the state, but for the United States as a whole, especially as the amount of energy Americans are demanding on average is going up pretty quickly.
Why has Idaho's minimum wage stayed the same since 2009, and what are the implications of this?
Idaho's minimum wage is the same as a number of other states. It's pegged to the federal minimum wage because the legislature has been unwilling or uninterested in raising it. The good news is that the number of Idahoans trying to provide for their families on a minimum wage is going down as market prices and market wages continue to increase. So while I would love to see the minimum wage increase, fortunately market pressures are raising the minimum wage, and so that's good.
What advice can you give to divided Americans as a Democrat who works with participants of January 6th?
There's a difference between knowing things and values, and people need to stick strong to their values, believing in fairness and equality, things like that. But when it comes to knowing, one of the things I learned in graduate school is the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. So I think it's really important for people to make sure that they're open to being persuaded and open to being wrong. I think a lot of people assume that, if you're a January 6th participant, your information literacy skills might be low. And so that person just probably doesn't have the ability to persuade me as much as someone else would. So I think that's how you work about it. That's how I work through it. I don't judge people and say I'm not going to work with people because of something you did in the past. But I think it is probably harder for them to persuade me.
How do proponents justify having a Qatari airbase in Idaho, and what effect does this have on local residents?
Well, proponents of the airbase will look at Department of Defense policy and negotiations. The agreement between two sovereign nations to establish this type of partnership was totally legal when it was crafted years ago. I think the base has been, and I don't think it's a Qatari air base. I think it's a section of the Mountain Home Air Force Base that will be designated to them. What will the impact be on the local community? I'm not entirely sure because this is a federal issue. As a state legislator, I'm not in the loop there. But anytime you have more soldiers and their families on base, you're going to have more people shopping in the stores. Now, if locals are concerned about people who have different skin color and accents, well, that's a personal issue of personal prejudice. That's not an issue of safety. If there's evidence that there is safety risk, well, then hopefully law enforcement will look into that.
How are urban and rural cultures different in Idaho, and what can politicians do in policymaking to balance the two?
I don't think they're as different as people think. I mean, Boise is just a city for country kids. A lot of people that live in Boise grew up in rural communities just like me, so we still have a lot of the tendencies. I think cars don't drive as fast in the city, so maybe traffic there's a lot more traffic, but they drive slower. People on top of people, you got a little bit more property crime. But other than that, we all need clean water. We all need clean air. And, the fact that some of us live in bigger cities doesn't mean that we don't have the same needs as people that live in rural communities. So while there are material differences, I don't think they're nearly as numerous as people think they are.
What influence should politicians have over classroom content?
I think politicians should trust experts. Teachers are experts. Educators are experts. And unless there is evidence that students are being harmed, I'm not sure what role politicians should play in involving themselves in what goes on inside classrooms. Now, if parents want to be engaged in their children's education and they don't feel like they have access to the things their children are learning or how their children are learning, well, that might become an issue that the legislature gets involved with, making sure that parents have the ability to exercise their rights. But when it comes to, what teachers are teaching and students are learning, I think we need to do a better job of kind of trusting experts.
How do you balance politicians' judgment on school policies and the judgment of parents on school policies?
Well, I think politicians, especially legislators, our job is to make sure that our public school system is thorough and accessible to the public because it's why we put it in the Constitution. So our job is to make sure that the system is working. if the question is, should we be down in the weeds telling teachers what to teach? I think the legislature has the authority to do that, but we're not subject matter experts in the content standards. We're not pedagogical experts. So I think our job is to put teachers and educators in a position to do their best work. I think that's the best relationship for politicians and schools.
How do you believe Idaho's legislative environment would be different without the influence of religion?
I don't think it would be much different than many other one-party legislatures. I think some people are guided in a really healthy way by their religiosity and their faith. And I think some people are probably a little too religious fundamentalist, and thus not really giving flexibility to other people and freedom to other people to live life the way they see fit. So I think, it's good in some regards, it's bad in some regards, but I don't think getting rid of it fixes any of the things that we think it would fix.
How do your personal values right now align or conflict against Idaho's school policies?
My personal values are I want as many kids as possible and families to have as much access to the types of education that are going to work for them. So actually, I love the fact that in Idaho we have so many choices. In my personal family, we've exercised a lot of those choices. I think as the state starts to spend general fund money on subsidizing private school, we need to be a little bit more intentional about who it is that we are trying to help. Who are we trying to make sure has an option that they wouldn't otherwise have? I think that's going to be the challenge as this continues to move forward.
How do you weigh the benefits of removing the Snake River dams for salmon conservation against the loss of renewable energy?
That's a great question. So there are a number of factors that go into this. I mean, you have to understand about how agriculture in Idaho works and how all our wheat growers get their commodities to markets, both domestic and international. They rely on the lock system from the dams. But you also have to talk to the outfitters and guides to understand the role that salmon as a keystone species plays in our ecology. You also have to understand that Idaho has among the lowest electricity rates in the country, and a lot of that is because of hydroelectric. So you have to understand what all of the relevant factors are before you start making decisions about whether to remove the dams. You also have to ask decisions about how are wheat farmers going to get their grain to market. So it's a very complex issue, and when people are much more cool and calm-headed about it, it's easier to get to yes on small incremental progress.
As a Democrat, when has a Republican changed your viewpoint on an issue, and when have you changed a Republican's viewpoint on an issue?
Yeah, I hope this doesn't come across as a cop-out, but I couldn't tell people right now that I convinced a Republican that climate change is real or something like that. But what I can tell you is that there are a lot of Republicans in the state, and Democrats too, who think the other side is the enemy. Republicans are not to be trusted, or Democrats are not to be trusted. I'm confident I have convinced some Republicans that I, Chris Mathias, a Democrat, am trustworthy. And I've been convinced by some of them that they are trustworthy. And I think that's important because that doesn't come through in a lot of our contemporary politics.
How much you have to be personally certain when passing a law? How much internal conflict shows well-roundedness?
You have to be certain, but you don't have to be 100% certain. I don't think you can get to 100% certainty every time. But if I'm 99% certain and the people I trust are 99% certain, then I think that gives me enough confidence to vote for or against something. The conflict, I think that's just something that you learn to deal with as you get older, as you get more educated, more wisdom, more life experience, and you've been confronted with these types of challenges. You just learn how to navigate them. So I think it starts to come naturally as you get older.
What guidelines do you follow when drafting bills to ensure that they're based in fact and not biases?
Well, I tend to rely on the drafting attorneys to make sure that the things they are providing are legal and constitutionally sound, which is always an important thing to do. Trusting experts, I think, is something that I try to do. I also try to make sure that, the information that I rely on to feed into legislation is verifiable information. As a trained social scientist, I tend to have pretty strict standards on the type of information that I'm willing to rely on. And I don't think I'm an average legislator in that regard, but when Chris Mathias says something, you can know for certain that it's correct and factual.
How do you achieve meaningful policy changes in a Congress dominated by your opposing party?
Steadfastness and patience. A lot of private conversations, coffee, lunch. People don't care how much you know unless they know how much you care. So once you've created relationships with people, trust-based relationships with people, they're much more inclined to listen to you And so long as you're picking issues that make sense and you know are viable in a one-party state, there's always a pathway to getting them passed. And I usually pass a couple pieces of legislation per year.
How do you balance your local constituents while representing the interest of all Idahoans when it comes to policymaking?
The most important thing is that you know as much as possible what the values of your constituencies are.
Yeah.
You know, why do they believe what they believe, and what do they believe? And if you know that and you never forget, then you know how to approach certain pieces of legislation. And when you do that, you have to ask yourself, is this in the best interest of the state? Not, is this in the best interest of my constituents? So imagine if, 53,000 Chris Mathias constituents got to be in the room, what would they say? And I try to distill those values down and contribute it to the process so that everybody else is doing the same thing, and we're trying to pass legislation that benefits everybody.
How do you convey uncertainty in decision-making while maintaining the public's trust in the government?
It's one of the hardest questions. It's important to acknowledge that, one of the reasons you run for office is to convince your neighbors and your hopeful constituents that you have the ability to synthesize big groups of information and make informed decisions, which gets to the question you asked. I think one of the ways I do it is I rely a lot on people who are thoughtful people. Not people who agree with me, but people who are reasonable, people who can think through problems and explain how they got there. When I was in school, I used to hate the question, show your work. I always used to just put the answer. But as I got older and as I got into this job, I realized that the people who can show their work are the best, because they're the ones that help you get comfortable grappling with the uncertainty and complexity that lies behind a lot of these pieces of legislation.
As a politician, what is one of the things that you are able to enjoy the most thanks to living in Boise?
The Capitol, so I represent District 19 in the legislature of 35 districts. I represent District 19, and the Capitol building is in my district. So it's easy for me to get to the Capitol building to work, which means I get to sleep in my own bed every night, which is not something every legislator gets. I get to eat dinner with my family every night, which is not something every legislator gets. So it really grounds me in my community and reminds me that I'm just a normal person like everyone else. And I think that helps keep me grounded.
Yeah. And what pastime would you think you enjoy that living in Boise helps you take advantage of?
I mean, I love the legislative process. I love the state level lawmaking process, because it's people with different backgrounds, different religions, different ethnicities, mostly. And, we all have to get to yes over and over and over. And so I love that process, even though I lose most of the time.
So you're a Coast Guard veteran with search and rescue experience. What's one moment that has shaped your leadership and responsibilities still to this day?
On my first unit in the Coast Guard, where I did federal fisheries enforcement and search and rescue, I was the lowest ranking person. I cleaned the head and I had the worst watch rotation. And I remember my captain saying to me, Chris, I know you're miserable and you're probably having doubts about whether you should have enlisted, but don't forget, when the red light goes on and we are screaming across the Bay of Fundy or something, when we get on scene and people are dying, people are drowning, ships are taking on water, it's just up to us, no matter how low ranking you are. The Avengers are not going to fall out of the sky and rescue people. So you have to do the two things that you're tasked with doing, just like I have to do the two things I'm tasked with doing. So I learned a lot about working as a team to make sure that everyone's doing the things they need to do to achieve that multiplier effect.
What's a normal day for you during a session that most teens would be surprised by?
No single day is the same. Some days start right at 7 o'clock. Sometimes they go until 7, 8 p.m. I think the most interesting thing is that early in session, there's a lot of hurry up and waiting, and then things get really intense for a couple months. And then the last couple of days of session are also a lot of hurry up and waiting again, because Senate bills have found their way through the House bills have found their way through the Senate. So there's just not that much to do other than to make sure that, due diligence on everything is complete. We've crossed our T's, dotted our I's. So no day is the same. They're all different. And that's one of the things I love about it.
What is your origin story? When did you think, I'm going to run for office, and what was happening in your life during that time period?
I don't know if this is when I knew I was going to run for official elected office, but when I was in college, I was a student body senator, and I passed a bill. And then I found out later that the president vetoed it. And one night I was out with my friends and I was super upset. And they were like, and this is a classic story for people who run for office, they were like, you should run for student body president. So I don't know if it was a good decision or a reckless one, but I did, and I won. And being the student body president of Boise State brings you into the state capitol building. And when you start, walking those halls, you start realizing like what your passions are, what your strengths are, what your skills. And that was kind of the beginning for me of realizing I might be good at that. And then years later, decades later, my state senator was gracious enough to let me fill in for her a couple times. And then I realized that I'm really fulfilled by legislative work. And so that's how I ended up running. Went from being really mad to really fulfilled.